My name is Malcolm Russell Einhorn. I'm presently a research professor at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, and I've had a nearly 40-year career in international development, starting with work in the former Soviet space. I came to that through law practice, but also the fact that I had been a Russian studies person in college and graduate school. And when I went to law school, I ended up being a research assistant to a professor of Soviet law, one of kind of the two leading specialists in the United States. And that exposed me even more to the legal system in the Soviet Union at the time. So when the Berlin Wall fell, I was practicing law in Boston and teaching courses on then Soviet law at Boston University Law School. And my wife and I moved back to DC. We'd met in DC. And I was in law practice in an East-West trade practice, but really felt that I needed to do something more societally transformative instead of just legal transactions. And there was an opening at the Central and East European Law Initiative for a director of programs in the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. So I took that position and oversaw programs in probably 7 or 8 of the former Soviet republics, everything from Russia to Central Asia. And I personally worked on a rule of law project in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and was very gratified by the work we were able to accomplish in a fairly difficult environment, involving legal aid organizations and some legal advocacy NGOs. The other thing that was pretty inspiring was working in Russia on the resurrection of the jury system, which had been a pre-revolutionary feature of the Russian legal system in the late 19th century. It did not survive the Bolshevik Revolution, but there were a lot of people working on that, both at Sealy and some other organizations. And, despite it sounding like something that was imported from abroad, it was, in a sense, a homegrown Russian product, most of whose features were simply revived. And for about a decade after that transformation, which was sort of 1995, 1996, you saw acquittal rates really go up quite significantly in Russia. And, it was only sort of with the Putin regime in the mid-2000s that you got, a sort of freezing or takeover of the system similar to what it was under the Soviets. But I went into this field generally, as I said, because I felt that it was really important to do something that had a broader impact with my sort of area studies skills. And there were a lot of people who, like me, had studied Russian and weren't sure where you could put those skills to use. For me, it was a choice of, intelligence, East-West trade, or arms control. And I had thought, maybe I'll go into arms control, but then I moved to Boston and started my work there. And it really, I think, was important for me to move back to DC and get back into things involving policy. So I think having a sociological bent and sort of understanding culture, which is so important for understanding how the rule of law can or cannot take root easily in a country, is kind of an invaluable perspective. And I was really not just excited, but also felt extremely privileged to do that work in the early 90s. I think it's got multiple dimensions. I think the first dimension is people get hung up on the magnitude of the investment and they say, why are you spending several $1 million in a country that has a deep authoritarian tradition? And, well, first of all, as may be the case now, even in certain places around the world, but certainly in Central Asia in the early 90s, right, there was a potential opportunity to push things in a certain direction that probably wouldn't change the overall complexion of the states, but would create kind of a kernel or a germ of civil society and sense of the rule of law among a certain cadre, and that could be passed on through the work of NGOs, possibly certain universities and law faculties, although they were quite conservative at the time. And so once you get past this question of, how much are you spending, the investment really pays a lot of dividends because you do have that tie to a number of legal actors, some of whom might be, you might say they're sort of like sleeper cells. They might be people who are young and they're going into government service, and their career might be largely defined by a very hierarchical context. But the ability of those people to swing things at the margins when it comes to legal drafting or, creating a slightly more open environment for rulemaking or open government, that's really, small potatoes when it comes to the investment, and yet the payback over time can be very large. And I think geopolitically, people forget that there's a two-way street in terms of who benefits. And the U.S. benefits from having these contacts and understanding the culture, even if it's circumscribed in the rule of law context, never mind, agriculture, health, others. And that provides, deep insights into regimes that we need to understand to influence them as that region does as a swing area, right? Caught between at least two superpowers, Russia and China, but also to some extent the West when it comes to trade and investment. So I think it has a real impact on our geopolitical influence that extends well beyond issues of legal reform. Yeah, I think and it is really important to keep it simple and narrow. Narrow in terms of the number of phrases and sentences and terminology that you use. So I would say it's fundamentally about circumscribing government power, and that means both limiting arbitrary state action, but also ensuring that laws and procedures are well-defined, well-established, and publicly available. So I would say it's really the subordination of state power to law, but those laws and procedures must be clear, they must be well-established, and they must be readily available. And then the other thing is to have state functionaries be competent legal professionals. You need some cadre of lawyers to execute just what I've said. They have to be competent, they have to be ethical, and they have to be independent. They cannot be mere functionaries who are doing purely the bidding of their superiors. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing in terms of an erosion at the Department of Justice, which has always had that tradition of functional independence despite being a part of the U.S. agency system. I think the rule of law, and I've used this actually to describe my work to one of my sons. I think fundamentally the rule of law is about due process for individuals and for businesses. And I emphasize businesses because sometimes we don't think about businesses as being an important, we think of them having a lot of power, but they too are subject to arbitrary action, et cetera, et cetera. But I explained it with respect to a situation that he was in having his newly acquired driver's license revoked for several truly minor infractions like rolling stops and a speeding ticket, et cetera. So I accompanied him to the Department of Motor Vehicles for a hearing, and the due process rights and privileges that I was just describing as being fundamental to the rule of law were on display there. And I said, my work overseas, well, people would kill to have these kinds of rights available to them because A, you've actually got a legal officer as your hearing officer. That isn't always the case, but the guy who was doing the hearing was a lawyer. Second, he told you what your rights were. Third, he told you where you could appeal. Fourth, he had a tape recorder. He taped it. So there's an impartial record of what was said. And I said, those are the kinds of procedural, and I should add, there were certain documents and evidence, right? The police tickets, et cetera, right? So the documentation was complete. And I said, that's the rule of law. It's there. You can speak your mind, you can argue your case, and you have some assurance that it's a reasonably fair process. Well, I think it's important for protecting individual rights and also the rights really that, again, organizations and businesses have. And that leads to a tradition of what we hope is an aspirational even-handedness that in turn has served the U.S. well for 2.5 centuries. I mean, it's a tradition of, I would say fairness and accountability that I won't say ensures, but certainly promotes private investment and a confidence in the overall legal system, which, attracts people from all over the world. So there's a stability and a predictability that citizens and the business community rely on. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think any of us who worked in that Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Central Asia region saw both the promise and the perils of where law reform can go, depending predominantly on the political culture. And I think we have long felt that our political culture was immune from erosion, and what we are seeing is a slow, or sometimes not so slow, slide into arbitrariness. Going back to that definition of the rule of law, there's a lot of arbitrary behavior that is not following well-established law and precedent, and it's everything from threatening judges who've been appointed by both parties, by presidents of both parties, and eroding their independence, intimidating them, to gutting all sorts of regulations and regulatory enforcement, dragging your feet on doing what the law says you must do at the behest of oligarchic players. And I think we can name a lot of them as, they may not be, the seven CEOs of the apocalypse, but there's a number of what we, I think, would call oligarchic pressures being exerted on our public institutions. Never mind the stuff that's going on with universities, law firms, the media. All of that is eroding what makes us an open society and a free society. Well, I do think we have this perspective on watching how things can erode. And unfortunately, it was easy to explain away certain failures because of the political culture. I worked in places like Latvia where it was clear they had a viable tradition in between the two world wars of the rule of law, and that memory continued through the communist period, and they were able to revive that and have the pull of European unification or integration be a real plus factor. We've also seen a lot of the rest of the former Soviet Union, go backwards when those traditions were far less secure. What's really alarming in this country is watching this erosion happen in a place where our traditions are far more robust. Unfortunately, the courts are holding the line, as I predicted they would, because you have such a deep penetration of legal consciousness within the legal profession, but also popular culture. And when civil society knows that things are eroding, they will, I think, rise up and push back. So I think the way to do it is really to try to do both the broad and the narrow, what would you call it, framing of where this erosion is happening, right? You need some broad examples where you can rattle off this, and this are happening, maybe not more than 5, but then you need vignettes that say, look, 3 years ago, this is what, it looked like to be a media outlet talking about this or that and not having either intimidation or favoritism govern how you operated your repertorial staff. So I think you need both some broad encapsulation, which is very difficult when they are flooding the zone in terms of having so much going on at once, but you also need some deep personal storytelling that makes it absolutely plain, sector by sector, whether it's, looking at farmers, looking at labor unions, looking at media, and try to draw that conclusion and say, do you want to go down this path further, or is it time to really push back and ally with other similarly affected individuals? So I've come back to Central Asia in the last 5 or 6 years, but starting in the early 2000s, I started doing more work in East Africa. And I would say that, when I look across all of the different projects I've worked on, number one, whether it's Africa or Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, I have been most passionate about and successful in working on what I call administrative justice. Particularly gratified by the work I did in that area in Latvia and Georgia. Now, again, those are two places that had a kind of independent political culture. Some did not predict Georgia had that much independence, but it obviously has shown that it does, despite a lot of pressure. But in both countries, I worked on what are called administrative procedure laws and freedom of information laws. And in both cases, these are laws, particularly administrative procedure, that benefit average citizens in the kinds of disputes they have with the government, in everything ranging from public benefits to business regulation and taxation, procurement. This is where the rule of law kind of meets the rubber on the road for an average person. It's not going to court. It's not even family law. It's not, criminal justice. It's everyday stuff that you or I would potentially have involvement in this country. So the bringing the rule of law down to earth, so to speak, has been really exciting for me. I still don't think it gets its due anywhere in the world because it sounds like it's the grubby inner workings of the bureaucracy. But that's precisely why I think it's fun and exciting, because this is where you can have an impact kind of on a mass scale too. Instead of changing one judge's outlook, changing a couple of law firms' outlook or NGOs' outlook, this is transforming both advocates and, on the other side, the government officials who are on the front lines, changing their handling of what are often hundreds or thousands of cases. And this is what, impact litigation often aspires to. Now, I'm not minimizing how much work this is, because we know government institutions are corrupt, but we also know that it's far easier, actually, in some ways, to bribe a judge than it is to bribe certain public officials, where you have certain, now digital and other safeguards in place, instead of whispered deals with influential parties. So I've worked on things that involve providing more information to the public, making it clear that the burden is actually on the state to prove its case in an administrative dispute, not the other way around, that it's up to the state to provide documentation, not for the poor citizen to run from agency to agency to get the paperwork that's necessary to process an application or challenge a dispute. So I think administrative justice is sort of an emerging area, far more common in the Commonwealth countries, the consciousness about that, than either the US or continental Europe, which are more statist kind of an orientation. But I think in Latvia, we were able to really roll out a very robust administrative procedure law that had many, many different kinds of protections and available information to and for the public. And then in Georgia, the same thing, worked on administrative procedure law implementation, which really galvanized. We were able to work with the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, which is a very dynamic group, because they recognized kind of how fundamental this was to the average citizen. So similar to what you would find in any bureaucratic context, these little things, more information, bureaucrats who are trained to listen and be a little more polite and attentive to the customer, so to speak, has, in some sectors, because it's always agency by agency, has had some real impact.